Today, I'm going to talk about how a client of mine thought that they did everything right to retire before 62, but later they ran into some serious issues. Over the years of helping people to retire, I've identified some specific blind spots in traditional retirement planning that consistently undermine even the most disciplined savers and their ability to retire early with confidence. So that's why I'm making this video today, to show you what these critical planning gaps might look like through a real client story, so that you can avoid the pitfalls and create a retirement plan truly aligned with your early retirement goals. So let's get right into it. We're going to talk about David and Karen. Now, I changed their names to protect their privacy. David's 61, Karen's 59. We met them right around the time when they first started thinking seriously about retirement. And like a lot of couples that I meet in that stage, they were feeling pretty confident about how things were going. Now, David's been a VP of operations at a manufacturing company for most of his career. Karen spent most of her years as an HR director before she scaled back to do some part-time consulting. But they've been disciplined savers throughout their entire adult lives. They paid off their mortgage early. They never carried too much debt. David maxed out his 401k year after year. Karen contributed steadily, and they saved about 15 to 20% of their income over the decade. So over time, that turned into a portfolio just north of $2.3 million. And like so many couples at this point, they felt ready because they had the number, they had the house paid off, and they had a clear picture of the life that they wanted to have in retirement. Now, David's plan was to retire at 62. Karen wanted to be fully done by 60, and they wanted to spend more time with their kids and their grandkids, travel a few months out of the year, typical retirement stuff. And they wanted to buy a little cabin in Colorado so that they could escape the Texas heat in summers, which is something that I can relate to. And at the center of their plan was this one big assumption. Once we hit $2 million, we're set. No formal plan, no real tax strategy, just the idea that they were going to start pulling from the 401k, use the Roth IRA later, and that everything would just fall in place. And I remember when David talked about it, you could hear the confidence in his voice. I mean, they had done everything right. Karen, though, she had that quiet look that I've seen hundreds of times. She was on board with the idea of retirement, but she also wanted to be sure, or more sure. So when we visited for what David thought was just one final check-in before he turned in his retirement notice, that's when the cracks started to show. The numbers didn't match the dream. One of the things that I noticed after working with so many couples at this stage is that it's usually not one mistake that throws off a retirement plan. It's a few really common beliefs that sound reasonable, because everybody tends to vocalize those same ideas without really questioning them. So David and Karen had a few of those baked into what they were thinking. And the very first one of that was, for example, if we hit our magic number, we're set. So for them, that number was $2 million. And it wasn't really something they had stress tested or modeled. It was just a number that they had picked over the years. Maybe articles they read, things that friends said, a rule of thumb floating around in the background. $2 million felt like enough. Now, the problem is that that number was built on a lot of quiet assumptions: steady markets, modest inflation, living maybe 20, 25 years in retirement, none of which they had actually questioned or tested. When we ran the numbers together, they could see pretty quickly that a static number doesn't protect you from a dynamic reality. Retirement isn't a single moment. It's decades of changing markets, changing healthcare costs, changing tax policy, and a lot of life happening in between. Now, the second belief that they leaned on was a classic, and that is the 4% rule works for everyone. And when I explained to them that the 4% rule was built around very specific portfolio and spending rules, and that it assumed a 25 to maybe 30-year retirement, starting at like a traditional age like 65, they started to see the gap. You see, David and Karen were planning to retire earlier, 62 and 60, and that's not a 20 or 25-year retirement. And their spending wasn't going to be flat. The first 10 years of their plan included travel, family trips, buying that cabin in Colorado. Their lifestyle in those early years looked nothing like a smooth, gradual spending curve that the 4% rule would assume. And then there was the third belief, and this one comes up a lot. Healthcare won't be a big deal until we're older. And when we actually looked at the numbers, the gap between retirement and Medicare was a big deal. And they had underestimated pre-Medicare healthcare costs by a lot. And it wasn't just the premiums, it was the deductibles, the out-of-pocket costs, and the reality that healthcare inflation grows faster than regular inflation. So they also hadn't built in any contingency planning for those potential long-term care possibilities, not because they were, careless people, but really just like a lot of people, they just never really sat down to map it out. And as we walked through each of these, we could see that, David's face was registering this new information, and what felt like a solid plan in his head started to look a lot shakier when we actually put it down on paper. And this is where a lot of people get blindsided, not by what they did wrong, but by what they didn't see coming. And they checked all the boxes that they thought mattered, but those boxes, they don't tell the whole story. And that's exactly the point when they started to realize that this plan is not going to hold up the way they thought it would. Now, if you feel like you're in a similar situation as David, click the first link in the description and watch a free training video that myself and my team put together, where we'll explain to you exactly how we've helped numerous people to safely retire regardless of their current situation. So be sure to check that out. But once we started a deep dive into their plan, the numbers didn't match the dream. See, on the surface, David and Karen's nest egg looked solid. But when we stress tested how their plan would actually play out over time, that's where the cracks started to show up pretty quickly. The first big issue was their withdrawal rate. So based on how they pictured funding their retirement, they were looking at pulling out almost 5.4% from their portfolio in the early years. And here's the thing, their plan wasn't built for a 20-year retirement. It was a 35 to 40-year timeline. So I showed them how that higher withdrawal rate might look if the markets cooperate. But if there's even a modest downturn early on, the math starts to break down fast. And in one scenario, their long-term success rate dropped from the mid-80s into the mid-60s range, and that got their attention pretty quickly. Then came healthcare. They had underestimated their pre-Medicare costs by about $20,000. No bridge plan, no strategy to keep those costs down. And with healthcare inflation outpacing regular inflation, the gap would grow even more over time. So we also modeled out a couple of realistic long-term care scenarios. Nothing extreme, just one of them needing some extra care for a few years. And it was pretty eye-opening. They were stunned as they started to see how that could also drain the savings. And then there was taxes. You see, their entire income plan was basically, we'll just pull from the 401k. No sequencing, no balance across accounts. But with almost 90% of their assets sitting in pre-tax accounts, that meant higher tax brackets, bigger RMDs down the road, and tens of thousands lost over that time that could have been avoided with some smarter planning. And this is where the emotional weight really started to set in. So David is a numbers guy, and he's proud of what they saved. But when some of those gaps came to light, you could see it on his face. And it was like, how is this even possible? Type of moment. We did everything right. Why doesn't this work? Those thoughts go through a lot of people's minds. And Karen's reaction was a little bit different. She was quieter, but it was just as real. She was more, less focused on the spreadsheets, and she was more thinking about their life, the trips that they had dreamed about, that little cabin in Colorado, the time with the grandkids. She didn't want to spend the next 25 years cutting coupons just so she could feel safe. And that fear is real for a lot of people, because this isn't just about numbers. It's about the very real possibility of working longer than you planned, or giving up pieces of the retirement dream that you had been thinking about for so many years. Now, for David and Karen, this was the moment that the illusion of their plan gave way to reality. And that hit them kind of hard. That moment was like a wake-up call for both of them. And up until that point, they were following a kind of generic retirement advice that works just fine on paper if you're retiring at 65, if you've got predictable spending, and you live in a perfect market environment. But that's not their story. And honestly, that's not most people's story. So the first big shift happened when I showed them why traditional planning rules started to break down for early retirees. So when you're stepping away from work at, say, 60 or 62 instead of 65, Your plan has to carry you a lot longer, and those extra years, they amplify every assumption: inflation, market risk, healthcare, taxes. So instead of planning around some static withdrawal amount, like 4% rule, what I did was I showed them what it would look like if they were to use modern guardrails instead. Now, the reality is that they've got a longer timeline, so their exposure to risk naturally increases, and none of us know exactly what the future will look like. Guardrails, they give you a way to plan for all the things you want to do while keeping that flexibility built in. So if things go well, you can lean in and you can enjoy. And if the future throws a curveball, whether it's markets, inflation, or healthcare, you've got a framework that adapts. So it's not just about guessing perfectly. It's about giving yourself a chance to do well when things go well and to stay safe when you need to navigate those changes. Now, the second big shift was showing them how to actually use what they've built, not just let it sit there and hope that it works out. Because up to this point, their entire plan was basically just pull it from the 401k. So I walked them through a real withdrawal strategy, one that prioritizes which accounts to pull from first, how to minimize taxes along the way, and how to keep their plan flexible. So we started by sequencing the withdrawals so that they weren't forced to retire entirely on pre-tax dollars in those early years. So by strategically mixing taxable and some Roth withdrawals and using those Roth dollars selectively, right? We lowered their taxable income in the early retirement years, and that opened the door for some Roth conversions in those lower tax brackets, which means less in required minimum distributions later and more flexibility for them down the road. So every dollar that they don't lose to taxes is a dollar that stays in their plan, and they can spend that on the life that they actually want to live. So seeing that clearly, which accounts to use, when to use them, and why, was a light bulb moment for them. This wasn't about having a big number anymore. It was about turning their assets into a coordinated income strategy that actually works. And then we pulled it all together. So their plan wasn't just missing that income strategy, it was missing integration. Healthcare planning was separate, taxes were separate, investments were all on their own island. But in retirement, all those pieces affect each other. We walked them through how to align everything: tax-efficient withdrawals, a clear healthcare bridge, and some structured income buckets. And what clicked for them was how just a few smart moves could reshape the entire plan. And that was the turning point. For the very first time, they stopped chasing the number and they started to build a paycheck that they could count on. And that's the shift that changes everything in retirement. Now, to help you make proper adjustments to your own plan, I want to walk you through the exact strategies that I used to help David and Karen so they could get back on track in retirement. And the very first thing that we did was we stepped back and we took a look at the full picture: the income timeline, Social Security, healthcare, taxes, and their retirement lifestyle goals. Because a retirement plan isn't just numbers. It has to support how you actually want to live. And from there, we designed their income plan using a modern guardrail strategy, not a static percentage rule. So instead of you can spend 4% forever, we built clear trade-offs. Spend more now, keep flexibility later. Guardrails lets them spend with confidence without losing control. We also added buckets, but only where they mattered: one for the healthcare gap before Medicare and one for the bridge years before Social Security. Now, by carving out those years, we took the pressure off the portfolio and we built flexibility right into the plan. Now, on the tax side, we looked at other opportunities to create more long-term efficiency. And I typically like to use Roth assets last because of their tax-free growth and the flexibility that they offer later in retirement. But in some cases, and theirs was one of them, using Roth strategically in those early years can make a real big difference. It allowed us to reduce the taxable withdrawals up front, keeping them in a lower tax bracket, and then setting them up for more favorable conditions for Roth conversions later. So over time, that helped to bring down their lifetime tax bill and their RMD exposure. When we stress tested their plan against real-world scenarios, early market drawdowns, higher inflation, unexpected healthcare costs, and instead of obsessing over probability of success dials, we focused on something a lot more practical, clear, short-term and long-term spending plans that are anchored by their guardrails. They could see exactly how their plan would adjust if they reached their lower guardrail. And just as importantly, how much more they could use of their money if they were to reach the upper guardrail. And the best part wasn't just the strategy, it was how they felt afterwards. You see, when we first met, their confidence was built on hope and a magic number. But once they saw how these pieces work together, guardrails, targeted buckets, tax strategy, and flexible spending, that confidence became more real for them. David finally liked the math and could see how it supported their lifestyle. And Karen said that she had finally had the evidence that she needed waiting so that she could finally relax and be ready for that next chapter of her life. And that's the point of all of this. A real retirement plan isn't about chasing a number or living with a probability of success dial over your shoulder. It's about building a strategy that adjusts with you so you can actually live the retirement that you've worked so hard for. Now, I understand a lot of this information can seem overwhelming at first. So if you want to find out how we help people to comfortably retire, click the first link in the description and watch the video training that myself and my team put together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.